St. Thomas's fifth way. It's also known as the teleological argument. Ladies and gentlemen, this argument has been around for a very long time, as is asserted by our textbook conversation. But this one made its own peculiar recent comeback. The recent version of the teleological argument that you are likely to have heard a version of, and many people want to claim it is a scientific argument. It is not a scientific argument, even though intelligent design creationists are attempting to pass it off as science. I just gave you my answer there. You might have heard the more recent version of this in terms of the most recent version of the argument is put forth by intelligent design creationists. However, the most recent versions of the argument really add nothing new to the core of the argument. The argument runs something like this. It's the observation that the world and all the things in it possess order. Now, this concept of order, found in Aristotle, is associated with that concept telos. Remember, telos was also known as Aristotle's concept of a final cause. Things that have telos imply that they have what? It implies purposefulness. Now, the next phase of this argument is this observation that things with telos could not have gotten that way. How? Chance. If I heard accident, you had the right idea too. Yeah, things that possess telos couldn't have gotten that way by chance. Therefore, the world must have been designed. And by implication, they would say that the universe is so well ordered and so complex that only the Christian God could have designed something of such magnitude. Now, this is one way of putting the argument. There are other ways of putting it. Now, there's a famous version of this teleological argument that was put forth in the late 18th century by a lay theologian by the name of William Paley. I want you to know this. Might be a Jeopardy question someday, I don't know. But William Paley's version of this argument in the late 18th century is known as the watch and the watchmaker. It argues by analogy. He says, suppose that you are walking through a heath and you come upon a stone. You would think absolutely nothing of it because you think of stones as simple things that are just brutally there. However, if you were walking through that same heath and you came upon a watch, you wouldn't think it just got there by cosmic accident. It's because the watch is an artifact. It has the marks of complexity. Now, guess what an artifact implies according to this argument? This one's easy. The argument is an artifact implies an artisan. Now, suppose that something is incredibly awesome and complex. What would you have to infer about that artisan? It must be some awesome artisan. This is why Paley and the like will argue that the only kind of artisan that would be up for the creation of the universe would have to be something like the Christian version of God. Now let me talk about a couple of the obvious strength of the argument that most people think of. Well, most people will say the universe is indeed complex. And most people find it to be unfathomable that something as complex as the universe could have just come about by chance. And this is by analogy. If you see a beautiful work of art, you don't think that it just happened how? Yeah, I got drunk and started splattering paint. In other words, that does not happen unless it's the work of Jackson Pollock. Good, I got a couple grins there. But yeah, a great work of art typically implies a skilled artist who had a plan in mind before he or she got started. And this is the analogy. Now, of course, if this analogy is strong, it might end up posing problems. And let me write the name of the philosopher who wrote a work in the 1770s that was highly critical of the argument for design. We're going to be meeting this guy in chapter 10. Hume, the philosopher David Hume, was a staunch critic of the argument for design. Now, one of his criticisms of it is that the argument smacks of anthropomorphic assumptions. In other words, it already presupposes that human beings and the way that we look at things sort of defines everything. It also seems to imply that who is very much like us. God is like us. Just like we are artisans that create works of art, God is the cosmic artisan. Now he says, beware of the analogies that you make, because they may end up backfiring on you. Because you'll notice that we make the claim that God is what? Yeah, well, good, and the bigger thing is perfect. We make the claim that God is perfect. You'll notice that even if you make the assertion that God is the architect of the universe, there is no evidence for what? He says there is no evidence present for the perfection of the cosmic artisan. Even if this argument is a good argument, all it would prove is that there is a designer. It would prove nothing whatsoever about the attributes of that designer. And I'll borrow a paraphrase from Hume. He says the argument also could not prove the peculiar doctrines of Christianity. Such as what? The virgin birth, the incarnation, the doctrine of the Trinity, and so on and so forth. All this argument proves, if it proves anything, is that the universe has a designer. He says it also wouldn't prove this. He says it also couldn't prove that the designer is one. You know what I mean by that, right? In other words, couldn't there have been a panel of designers? Because if you take the analogy of the universe with a house, for example, a house typically doesn't just have one designer and one artisan. It oftentimes has a committee of architects and a whole buttload of different people, that's not the technical term, and a whole lot of workers that build the house. Now you'll notice that there are some theological systems that assert what? They assert polytheistic stories to explain things. In other words, they explain it in terms of gods. There is no evidence in the teleological arguments that proves the unity of God. And here's the biggie. There is nothing in the argument that could prove the goodness of God. And this is kind of what segues us into the problem of evil. David Hume says that many people look on the world and they don't see a thing of cosmic goodness created for the purpose of multiplying God's love. What some people see is a place of great cataclysm that is not well suited to human beings. As a matter of fact, in many senses, the world seems suited to creating billions of unhappy people. When you consider what? That in the grand scheme of things, most people live most of their lives in material want. Not enough to eat, etc., due to no fault of their own, and so forth. Or I'll give you the biggie. And this is one that Hume mentions, but it's also one that's mentioned by the French Enlightenment figure Voltaire. How many of you have heard of a book by Voltaire? It's a thin little book. It's called Candide. Good. Some of you have heard of that satire of his. Well, it has been said that Voltaire wrote that novel in response to what cataclysmic event that happened during his lifetime? An earthquake struck Lisbon. It killed tens of thousands of people. And remember, this is a time period when the world is not nearly as populated as it is right now. So if the world were populated as it is now, it would have killed in excess of 100,000 Lisboners. But it killed tens of thousands of people. Now, of course, Voltaire asked the question, could a loving God will a world such as this one? A world that seems to be designed for the purpose of multiplying pain, misery, and suffering. This is why one of the criticisms made by Hume and others of the teleological argument says, for every person who says that the design has the marks of being created for a greater good, you could just as easily say, if the universe were designed, that it was created to multiply misery of sentient beings. So it couldn't prove the goodness of God anyway, let alone the Christian God. Now, one of the reasons why this argument has so much staying power is because the people who make the argument never talk about the criticisms. You've noticed that, perhaps. The other reason why it has so much staying power is because it does highlight what undeniable facts. That the universe does seem to be complex beyond all human comprehension. Although not entirely complex beyond all human comprehension, because after all, what have we designed to try to explain the universe? Yeah, scientific mathematical models for explaining the structure of the universe. And by the way, folks, this does not hurt the argument for complexity. Some people would say this merely helps the argument for complexity. Sir Isaac Newton was a Christian, but an unconventional Christian. He argued, in not so many words, that the author of the universe was kind of like a divine what? That the author of the universe was like a divine mathematician. And it's understandable that the person laying out the mathematical model for physics would look at the universe this way. Because the fact is, even though the universe is very complex and very difficult for us to comprehend how it could have come about, it is intelligible to some extent. Because we can comprehend it in some senses mathematically, even if we don't know all the ins and the outs. Now, the fact that it is mathematically ordered kind of attests to this complexity. However, David Hume, David Hume is relentless. He says, what would you expect us to find in the universe? Because after all, as human beings, what do we seek in everything? We seek order. One of you said meaning. We seek that too. But yeah, we actually seek to uncover that order. And guess what? If you look hard enough for order, you will what? You will find that order, whether or not the order is inherent or not. You know, the same way that if, you know, you're laying, I guess you guys all had electronic devices growing up. But you know, we'd be playing outside, then we'd take a nap, just looking up at the clouds, and you know the old cliche, this is like, was it Charlie Brown and the Peanuts gang? You know, this is kind of old-fashioned, I know, for postmodern students. But you know, you'd be staring at the clouds and, hey, I see a mean-looking old lady up there in the clouds. Or, hey, I see my dog Rover up there. Dude, you see the dog Rover up there, but it's just a bunch of water vapor. You know what people see. Perhaps it's us doing the interpretation and not the other way around. Hume says, of course we're going to find order in the cosmos. We are the ones who, through our eyes, are trying to seek order because we want the universe to be intelligible. As a matter of fact, our survival sometimes depends upon its being intelligible. And we've made up some pretty wild and crazy stories in order to make the universe intelligible. I mean, the myths were created in order to try to make the world intelligible. Of course, we would say, what about those myths? Oh, they're just some weird cooked up stories that Norse people, Celtic peoples, and Greek peoples made up. How do we know that our myths are any more what in the grand scheme of things? Yeah, any more reasonable or any more true in the grand scheme of things? The skeptic David Hume would say, we don't. And if you think that they are, you just might be showing you how ethnocentric and arrogant you are. But anywho, why are they so loud out there? I don't have much time, folks, so I want to do what